forums around a common theme. In this program year, our theme is diving deeper together so all will flourish. This theme builds on our heightened awareness of the systemic and critical issues affecting our community, brought to greater attention in recent years and was especially in response to the murder of George Floyd. Through the forums, we will learn about longstanding needs and become more prepared to support the flourishing of all members of our community. Today, we welcome Michele Garnett McKenzie from Advocates for Human Rights. Michele leads the organization's research, education, and advocacy team and is responsible for the Advocates' domestic policy issues, including migration, human trafficking, and policing. Prior to joining the Advocates, Michele was in private immigration practice and had served as a judicial law clerk. She received her legal degree cum laude from the University of Minnesota Law School and her BA cum laude from Macalester College. Michele's presentation today is timely as December 10th is International Human Rights Day. A couple of short notes to our audience before we begin. For those attending in person in the Meisel room here, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you during the Q&A session so that all, including those on the live stream, can hear your questions and comments. And for those attending on live stream, please submit your question or comments in the live stream chat and we will be monitoring that and raise your question or comment. And with that, I will turn it over to Michele. Welcome.
All right. No matter who precedes me, I have to lower the microphone. So thank you so much and good morning. It is really a delight to be with you and an honor to be with you today in anticipation of International Human Rights Day and really celebrating this great year of partnership with Westminster. We have been really honored to be a community partner and we need your partnership. We need advocates for human rights like Nan, who's been with us really as a volunteer, a board member, and so there are a few volunteers here at Westminster. You can ask me how if you are interested, and we'll talk more about that at the end as well. I'm happy to answer questions. But as we look at International Human Rights Day, it's a chance for us to reflect on shared global principles of justice, of peace, of equality, really of the building blocks for life with human dignity. And that recognition of human dignity for many people is deeply embedded in spiritual and faith traditions and is perhaps what brings you here every week to be in community. But it's beyond that. It's a legal framework as well right now. And so that gives us some specific ways to try to not only envision what our public policy should do and how that should reflect our values, but to hold those to account. And that is a great deal of what we work on at the Advocates for Human Rights. Today I'm going to be talking about the situation of Afghanistan and refugees who are arriving in Minnesota and kind of dig into that. But I want to use that as a way to illustrate some of the systemic problems, some of the choices we've made that have put us in the situation where we are today, and invite us to think about that as we tackle all sorts of problems, housing, health, economic justice. These are all choices we make actively in our community, in our government, in our society, and we're responsible for those and the outcomes of them. So just before I dive in, the Advocates for Human Rights, as Nan said, is a organization that's been headquartered here in Minneapolis. It's been around since 1983. We're getting close to 40, and that's going to be an exciting milestone for us. Today we work on a number of intersectional issues, from death penalty abolition to LGBTI rights, and working with human rights defenders in countries around the world where people's lives and freedom are at stake, to women's human rights, to issues including migration. And that's, of course, what we'll be focusing on today. The QR code on the screen, if there are any QR code readers at home, that is our website. And so, as I know this presentation will be circulated afterwards or available to people, you're welcome to check out our website as well for more details about the kind of work we do. And to read some of the work that we've done. We just published a report on Thursday. It was a long week getting it to publication on the backlash against human rights that we're seeing worldwide, and particularly affecting women's human rights defenders, or our colleagues in countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, former Soviet countries, are literally having to pack their bags and flee because they were working with women experiencing domestic violence and are being targeted with death threats. So this kind of work is happening all the time in lots of different ways. And our job at the Advocates is really to see how those things intersect, and also how we as individuals here in Minnesota or wherever we are can be advocates for human rights. We all have a part to play. And so one of the things that we have really incorporated into our mission since the beginning was that volunteers are part of doing our work. Last year we had more than 1,500 volunteers from Minnesota and from communities around the world working on our programs, working with us on representing clients, monitoring immigration court, doing research, helping with litigation, potentially going to the United Nations to do advocacy. Nan and I were both on the scheduled trip right before COVID that had to cancel. But all of that work is volunteer engaged and is part of our mission. So I'd like to turn to Afghanistan now. And put that situation sort of into some context, right? Today, there are more than 82.4 million people who are forcibly displaced from their homes. That's an estimate from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or the UN Refugee Agency. This estimate was in June of 2021, before the most recent disruption to Afghanistan happened when we started to see the US troop withdrawal and NATO allied forces withdrawing at the end of August. So before that happened, we were looking at about 82 million people who had been forced to live outside of their homes because of war, conflict, persecution on account of their race, their religion, their identities. That is a vast number of human beings, right? And has been steadily growing in the decades we've been counting the refugee population. Most of those folks, the big green swath on the chart, are internally displaced. So they've never crossed an international border. They're within their countries of origin or citizenship, giving them much more limited access to protection. That means that Afghans who had to move from one place to another as the Taliban has swept through in the recent months, they don't count as refugees. They're internally displaced people, and there's very little the international community can do to protect folks. We were in a conversation on Friday with someone who has worked with in Afghanistan, a family who is there and they want to get them out. But we don't have an embassy working in Kabul at the moment. So the only way that person now is going to be able to get to safety is going to be to somehow get out of Afghanistan and get to another country where they can process in. And they're joining a very long line of people who want to get into the United States right now. So that's one example, the internally displaced people. But of the remaining refugees, people who have crossed international borders, most of them are not coming to the United States or to Europe or to a third country, but are remaining with their neighbors. So this shows, this was put together by the Council on Foreign Relations from UNHCR data, again, before the US withdrawal, of an estimated 2.8 million Afghans who were living outside their country, right? The United States hosted 2,000 of those refugees at that point. Pakistan, 1.4 million. Iran, 780,000. 3 million internally displaced. Europe, 557,000. Right? So of the 2.8 million refugees, most were right in the region. The biggest place where refugees go is not to third countries. They go across the border to a refugee camp, to family who might be living there, to a friend or a contact, to live in a camp or to live in a city, try to rent an apartment. We saw with the Syrian refugee crisis, very quickly people moved to countries right around Syria and spent all of their savings trying to rent apartments and wait for jobs during what they hoped would be a very short disruption, and eventually became apparent it was going to be an extended, if not permanent, disruption in their lives. So this neighboring refugee hosting is something that we see in refugee situations all the time. But one of the things we don't think about when we are thinking about refugees, I think as deeply as we need to, is that war is refugees are necessarily a part of war and conflict. That is just what happens, right? That when we engage in armed conflict, for whatever reason, in whatever way, refugees are a byproduct. And planning for refugees, when we plan for military involvement, needs to be there. And this is true for the United States military intervention, but it's certainly true just in any armed conflict. That's where we see people fleeing because they are on the wrong side of the conflict, right? World War II produced millions of refugees and gave rise to the refugee protection framework we have today, which is an international treaty that spells out the definition of a refugee. It's a person who's outside their country of origin, owing to a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. That reflects the population that was forced out of their homes and left at a border where they couldn't get in, right? It was the first recognition that that individuals have some sort of right to be safe, or at least to have a fair determination of whether they would be subjected to threats to their life or their freedom to get into another country. Because you can't flee persecution in your country if you can't get into another, right? Refugees or people who would have been refugees in World War II sought to get into any country they could and were very regularly rebuffed under the principle that any country has the right to control its borders 100%. The refugee law put a little window in that said, yes, nation states have the right to control their borders, but they also have the obligation to protect the human rights of those who appear at them and give them a fair hearing, give them a decision. And that's, reflects reality, right? That we need to have that safety valve. When we look at Afghanistan and our withdrawal timeline, people were planning for the anticipated refugee problem as the military drawdown was happening. And it was very difficult. I think there was undoubtedly a lot of negotiation with other countries about who would take the refugees that would be processed, or who would take allies while we vetted them and brought them into the US. And not surprisingly, there was not a large number of countries who said, yes, give us all of the people that you want to screen that, are kind of your responsibility. Let them sit with us for the next few years, and we'll just, we'll deal with it while you manage your political optics, right? That was there were not a lot of takers on that. But there was, certainly a conversation, a group called Evacuate Our Allies had been looking at the numbers, anticipating the hundreds of thousands of people we're now seeing who needed protection or would be likely to need protection once the US withdrew and the Taliban reasserted control. But things really unfolded very quickly, as we all know. I mean, we saw images at the airport. We saw people, fleeing around the city trying to get to the airport. We saw people scrambling for airplanes. By August 30th, there were about a little over 124,000 people who had been airlifted out of Afghanistan by the United States. 124,000 people, more than that, airlifted out in the space of about a month. And that was extraordinary. I mean, that was a huge effort. It took a lot of logistics. It took a lot of money. It took a lot of time. It took risk on behalf of the pilots who were flying in and out, and in all of the mechanics that were going on, because of course the Taliban moved in very, very quickly, right? By just the beginning of September, there were already 23,876 people who'd arrived through the airlift, through the evacuation into the United States. Again, a tremendous concerted effort on behalf of the US to make that happen. And by the beginning of October, we had 53,000 people on military bases throughout the United States. Today, there still are some people in that initial airlift outside the US on what we call lily pad sites. They were hopping to a temporary place before they could get onto the bases in the United States. So it appears that we have the capacity, when we have the will, to be able to really move quickly and to do essential protection. But I want to think about how much of that we could have done ahead of time, or why it had to be such a scramble, and then break down a few of the things that are coming about, or that were coming to light as we're working with people. Here, we have a legal clinic on site at resettlement hotels in Minnesota. That's our role, because of course people are coming without legal status at this, or permanent legal status at this point. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the special immigrant visa for US allies. You might have seen this in the news, the SIVs, the special immigrant visas, the translators and military, like people who were actually working directly for the US government and military. The special immigrant visa program was launched in 2007, and it's been operating for Afghan and for Iraqi allies since that time. But it has not been, it's not been well administered. And there's no surprise here. It, at the time of the withdrawal, had 18,000 people with pending SIV applications that were just sitting in the backlog because we hadn't really given the resources to adjudication that we needed for that program. The part of the US government that thinks about and makes decisions about applications to come into the US, it's called US Citizenship and Immigration Service. It's part of the Department of Homeland Security. but it is a tiny part. Its budget is somewhere, I think, about $5 billion annually compared to about $60 billion in enforcement budgets between border and interior enforcements. It's a very small agency, and it is, with very few exceptions, funded entirely by user fees, so application fees that people pay. There's very little congressional appropriation that goes into our U.S. CIS budget every year. If any, and some of those monies often go, also the filing fee monies go to enforcement operations. So there weren't very many people making decisions on these applications, and what happens then is they back up. And so people, there were 18,000 people who could have been not airlifted out, but who could have been kind of systematically brought in an orderly way over the past several years that we just didn't invest the resources in doing that. So some of the people being evacuated have pending applications for SIV status that are just, will hopefully resolve now once they're here. We had other visas as well. People coming into the U.S. through the airlift included U.S. citizens and people with lawful permanent residence and refugees who had been in Afghanistan trying to work with their families to get them through often, or still stationed there. So when we were on site at Fort McCoy, there were U.S. citizens with their spouses, and their spouses had applications partway through the process that once we shut down the consulate have stopped and now have to be restarted here in the U.S. with filing of a new application. The filing fees on that are about $1,200 because, again, that's what pays for this whole infrastructure. And people are just confused, right? I've got paperwork approved, but we were going to have an interview. The interview was canceled. Now what do we do? And so that is include that kind of folks are included in the airlift and evacuation. And there were also, of course, people who just happened to have a visitor or student visa or something else, and they were in Afghanistan in August and were able to come in on that and now have that status, but nothing permanent about that. They'll have to figure out what to do. Now, you're probably thinking, certainly this is how I was thinking, and I think when we look at how the U.S. government has administered the evacuation arrivals, how the U.S. government was thinking that people would be coming as refugees, right? People are fleeing persecution on account of their identities or their affiliations, their political activities, their perceived political beliefs or religious beliefs, and would be coming to the U.S. as refugees. There were a couple of problems with that. One is that we can't really use the refugee law, the specific statute of Section 207 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, to admit people as refugees when they are not outside their country of origin at the time of the flight. So everyone we were airlifting out hadn't yet crossed an international border. They weren't technically a refugee. They were still internally displaced. And so that didn't quite fit. So the evacuees weren't coming that way. People now going somewhere else and then coming to the US, that might work. But people coming directly weren't. But the biggest problem, and I think we could have worked around that, there's some options in the statute for dealing with that. But the biggest problem is that our refugee resettlement system is not designed as an emergency response system to bring people to safety, right? Our refugee resettlement system is a metering system designed to limit and control the number of refugees who actually come to the United States through resettlement. Now, before I go on, I want to be really clear that the United States, even under our lowest refugee admissions, really has admitted the most refugees total of any country in the world. We're a very, very critical part of the world's refugee resettlement infrastructure, because there are just a few countries who really take in refugees from refugee camps into this third country resettlement. Most refugees, are sitting at the neighboring country. The hope from the international community is that those people will go home. They'll be repatriated. That's our goal. People are disrupted, they get repatriated when the conflict is over or the threat has passed, and they resume their lives. If they can't do that, the next solution is that they're locally integrated. They become part of the community, the country to which they fled initially. So if you're from Afghanistan, you go to Pakistan, eventually you just settle in Pakistan. They figure out a way to absorb the 1.5 million people into their communities and they become Pakistani. And when people are in specific threat or have family relationships already here, they sometimes will qualify for admission to the US as refugees. We bring in about, this year our ceiling was what started out at 15,000. We didn't get to that in 2021, the fiscal year that just closed out. And at most, our refugee ceiling has been about 125 or 130,000 people. That's, less than 0.5% of the world's refugees, right? So the refugee resettlement system is designed to meter the number of people who come in and how they come in, and then to assist them once they arrive with, kind of integration into US life. I think this community likely partners regularly with refugees being resettled and helping them find food, making sure they know how to use the bus system, getting them housing, sponsoring the families so that they can get the kids enrolled in school and kind of jumpstart their new life here in the United States. So that will happen. We will start to see Afghans coming through refugee resettlement, but it's going to take time. There is a new refugee category that's been opened. There are bigger numbers. That infrastructure will start to kick in, and people will get adjudicators overseas to the different refugee camps, and we will start to see Afghan refugees as a regular part of our resettlement going forward, I'm sure. But that was not how people came in. People came in on parole. Most of the 130,000 people coming into the United States during the evacuation are being paroled into the United States. That sounds as stable as, as it is. Humanitarian parole is a way that we can essentially bring somebody in or allow somebody to enter the US who has no other immigration option. It's purely discretionary. It's an act of either national interest or humanitarian interest that the US exercises as a matter of discretion. And so what happened for the folks being brought in both directly, because there were lots of people in those first months or first weeks coming directly out of Kabul and then from the lily pads, has been this humanitarian parole status. Humanitarian parole is temporary. It leads to nothing, and it doesn't allow you to get federal public assistance. Typically, it doesn't give you a green card. When you come as a refugee, a year later, you have to file an application to get permanent residence or a green card in the US. This doesn't allow you to do that. You might be able to renew a parole application. You might not. We will see, right? So parole is fleeting. It is, in this case, being offered for 2 years. So everybody who's come in, their clock is ticking before their status their permission to be here will expire. And it's terminal. It doesn't lead anywhere. That's not how our refugee resettlement infrastructure is typically designed. When we bring folks in and welcome them as refugees, we assume they have permanent legal status. And so we're concerned with getting the kids enrolled in school and the vaccinations and all of that, and getting people into housing and jobs. And we're really pretty effective at that in the resettlement arena. But this particular group does not have legal status. Luckily, the state of Minnesota refugee coordinator and that office really recognized that, and we've been working with them since August to coordinate legal services, because we'll have to do something for people. Right now, we're doing a lot of triage in the resettlement hotel with people, trying to make sure they understand what their status is and what their options are, and have some sort of game plan. As I said, some people are permanent residents, some had applications pending, so if there's something already going on, we're going to need to get their files and figure out what can happen. But it's really hard for people to know what their status is. Partly, people are overwhelmed, they're confused, they've experienced really acute trauma. And we're hearing from people that the U.S. brought them in, so many people believe that the U.S. is handling all their paperwork, which is not true. The U.S. brought them in and gave them parole, but the next step is completely in the hands of the individuals. They're responsible for filing any applications they need to stay here. As I said, it leads to nothing, and so everybody is going to need to figure out something. Some people, have those pending special immigrant visas. Some people have, degrees and are going to get hired into a professional job that will be willing to file immigration paperwork for them. Some people have family here, and those are going to work out. But not everybody has that. Most people don't. And surprisingly, not everyone has parole. To enter on parole, you have to have had a specific application filed for you, each individual. You don't come as a family. So every individual member of the family needs one. So we're seeing infants who were born after the parole process being waved through. And so they're undocumented. And we're not entirely sure what we're going to do with that. So far, Congress's response to this has been, we'll have everyone file for asylum, and we'll just put those cases at the head of the line. An asylum application, Nancy, they're not easy, right? An asylum application is complicated. It's right now about a 15-page form that has to be completed in English, with evidence showing that you individually are targeted on account of one of those protected grounds. It has to be adjudicated by a specific officer, an asylum officer, who right now that office has been on hold because of COVID. They've just resumed interviews. We had our first interviews last week in Minnesota. They have a pending backlog of 350,000 asylum cases. There are about 800 asylum officers nationwide. There are 8 offices, and they have 350,000 pending cases. If you are job hunting, they are hiring, but this is a very specialized team of adjudicators. So even if we said double your number, doing that, training that number of new officers would just be overwhelming. And this is another area where our failure to invest, and our strategic deliberate failure to starve this particular office of resources is coming back now to haunt us, right? The asylum office is tiny, and it's charged with all sorts of things, from handling asylum seekers at the southern border to going through cases here in the interior. And it's been a political football. and an area where we just, again, have not put in resources compared to the resources we invest in other parts of the immigration enforcement system. Importantly, U.S. immigration laws are completely unforgiving. If a person makes a mistake on their asylum application, or they miss the 1-year filing deadline, applications for asylum have to be filed within a year of arrival in the United States. Ultimately, they can be deported. So if people kind of come in, they think they've got status, they have this parole, and they just sort of go on with their lives, eventually we're going to catch up with them and say, you're undocumented here, and they will be deported back to Afghanistan. If a family member gets in trouble with the law, they will be an undocumented person facing deportation. So we're investing all of this in getting people into the U.S. in this massive airlift, and we need to make sure that we have a mechanism to protect them, and we don't right now. We do have an opportunity, and it's going to jump ahead here in a second, I suspect. There we go. We do have an opportunity to change the legal framework here. And I really invite you to look at this. We can file or have a new law passed that will address the specific population. We've done this before with Cubans, with Nicaraguans, with Vietnamese, there was a Syrian act. I mean, this is what happens when we have large flows of people that we can't kind of stuff into our very narrow channels of immigration and asylum. Right now, we are working with Senator Klobuchar's office on an Afghan Adjustment Act, and are hopeful that will be introduced in Congress. It did not make it into the continuing resolution that just passed and extended the budget into February. So there is work to be done. Without a special bill, every single person who comes in is going to have to be, go into that asylum queue. And if you want to, we've got a fact sheet if you want to kind of know what you're talking about and give any of our congressional leaders a call. We invite you to do that. Now, the situation's been overwhelming. It has been confusing, but it has created a real opportunity. For one thing, and this is where I think I make lemonade out of lots of things, but I really think this is true. We know we can bring people to safety in large numbers, that we have the capacity to act and to use our refugee protection sort of call and spirit to actually do immediate urgent protection, not just refugee metering. We can bring people to safety when we want to. And we did that through airlifts. We did that through housing on bases. We didn't use, I think, our disaster relief infrastructure as well as we could have. So one improvement will be thinking about how organizations like Alight, the American Refugee Committee, that have great experience in refugee camp deployment could be used on arrival here. They weren't invited. We were thinking of this in refugee resettlement, not that overseas refugee camp experience. So we can build better. We right now are moving people into hotels, and we have a centralized spot where people can stabilize and we can deliver a lot of services in a cohesive manner rather than having to chase asylum seekers around the state. Right now, the advocates, we work in Minnesota, North and South Dakota with a variety of populations, and one is unaccompanied kids. We've had 850 unaccompanied children come to Minnesota in this past year. We have very few of them in our caseload because we can't connect with them. Kids aren't really good at following up on their legal matters. I don't know how many of your kids really worked well with their attorneys, but this is a hard population. Having centralized spaces, that's something we can do. and bringing that ultimate resettlement infrastructure to bear on the asylum seekers who come into the United States, not just in large numbers like the Afghan population, but individually, one by one. We have over 1,000 cases in our office that have one by one had to find their way. That a volunteer attorney and our accompaniment folks and people are piecing together when we have a robust, knowledgeable professional infrastructure we can bring to bear that mobilizes congregations and mobilizes groups and communities. This is the first time in the 25 years I've been working in this where I've seen that opportunity really present itself. And with the state leadership, with our partnerships that we're testing in this moment, I hope that we can do that in the future. And the point of all this is not just to respond, right? We can see UNHCR has Afghan emergency at the top, but there are a dozen that are on the top. The emergencies are all over. South Sudan, Venezuela, Yemen, Syria, Sahel, Nigeria, Congo. That can be overwhelming, but there's a reason we do this, and it really is this individual work. And I'll just close out because I think we need a little hope after we have a little.
Sí, yo me imagino y siento su dolor, siento su tristeza, siento su felicidad. El arte es un amor. Yo quiero que la gente lo vea y que digan que sí, alguien está pensando en nosotros. Alguien está ahí preocupado por nosotros o alguien desea algo mejor para nosotros. Me gusta mucho pintar porque ahí es otro mundo. Puedo crear todo lo que me gusta crear. Es como si Dios creara el mundo, entonces yo creara mi mundo ahí.
Cada día estaba más amenazas, más muertos, más problemas, la situación era muy difícil. Saliendo a la escuela y colegio, regresar, no sabíamos que si íbamos a regresar o no. Había dos opciones, irnos por la frontera, o sea, las fronteras cruzando, como miles de personas cruzaban por Europa, o sacando la visa para llegar a Ecuador.
Tengo muchos sueños, ¿no? Quiero ser internacionalista, quiero seguir relaciones internacionales. Es la mejor manera de poder ayudarle a la gente también. Quiero pintar y pintar y pintar y pintar. Quiero seguir pintando.
This young girl is an Afghan refugee who fled to Ecuador with her family. They've resettled, and she's an artist, like a muralist, around her new city. And when you could hear the voice, and you probably thought that was a Spanish speaker. That's an Afghan who's learned Spanish. And she's living a vibrant life today with her family, in community. We can do this, and we do it for a reason. And it's so that all of us can live with peace, with dignity, with justice and freedom. So I'll leave things there. We have an upcoming event on December 10th at noon that you can tune in for if you want to hear more about the backlash against human rights. And I'm really grateful for you being with me this morning and allowing me to be here. So,
Michele, thank you very much. We've got time for questions here. I don't know if we have any in the room here. Please raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic, or if we've got any online. And yeah, Sandy.
and thank you for waiting for the microphone so that we don't exclude our at-home folks.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. Our church is right now in the middle of sponsoring one family, and I think there's anticipation of more. Could you explain to everybody, and I've been involved in this too, but I still don't completely understand all of the connections and who does what. Could you explain sort of as a family comes in, what does Hennepin County do? What do the sponsoring organizations do? Just walk us through that, please.
Maybe. That's a good question. And hopefully there are connections that I don't know about that are happening as well. When it comes to this particular Afghanistan resettlement experience, the first piece, the first partner is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. They're actually working with people on the military bases to get their work permits applied for. So one thing that has to happen, all those work permits have gone to the resettlement agencies or the International Office of Migration. That's another player in this that does a lot of the movement of people, the physical movement of people who are seeking refugee status. Getting those work permits to people at the site. So we have one is the federal government getting work permits to people. Refugees come in authorized to work because they're refugees. Parolees need to actually apply for a work permit and get that work permit in their hands before they can get a job. So that's one component. The state of Minnesota has been coordinating the housing and making sure that we have that hotel site, that initial housing site. It's been essential to do that and get people here in a stable place where they can have food and shelter and kind of stability for at least 30 days because unlike refugees, they can't apply for any federal public assistance, but Minnesota does allow some basic enrollment in health care and in other essential services if you are a resident here for 30 days. So there's that piece. So the state is coordinating that. And also the state is the point of contact with the federal resettlement folks about how many people we're equipped to take at any given time. So they're in constant dialogue with not only the federal authorities, but with the on-the-ground Minnesota Council of Churches and other agencies about what capacity is. And that conversation is happening all the time. Then we have Minnesota Council of Churches and the other resettlement agencies here, Lutheran Social Service, who else? Arrive Ministries, the International Institute, Catholic Charities down in southern Minnesota, who are working with people who are resettling as refugees in the same way that the Council of Churches does, coordinating with congregations and others. I just was at an apartment building, and the apartment building itself is doing what you all are doing as a congregation. So they can work in different ways if you have creative ideas. I'm sure they'd love to know that. And those agencies are affiliates of one of I think 11 national resettlement agencies. So there is an infrastructure that really is inside the Beltway that works more with the State Department and IOM and the U.S. immigration authorities that way. So Minnesota Council of Churches is working with U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. No, who are you? Church World Service. Church World Service and Church World Service is, figuring out how many they can take with all their affiliates in different states. So there's a constant allocation. And it's a very planned space. They're doing that. Any public assistance that the state offers runs through the counties. So Hennepin County or wherever people are, that's all administered not by the state but the county. The state authorizes it and gets the money allocated. And then the various entities like school districts and things are engaged. The resettlement agencies have employment counseling. Mainly their role at this point is to try to get people employed. So they're very focused on getting people from arrival to employment as soon as possible because they only have a short window of time to work with people under federal funding. So that's another piece. And they do have pretty substantial federal funding to accomplish that. And so that's happening. And then, as I said, the sort of oddball is the legal services side because we're typically not needed in refugee processing, but we are in this case. And so we're working with all of those actors at the resettlement sites and then also taking in cases that are coming at us. There are Afghan folks living in Minnesota already who need us to apply for asylum. So we're doing that piece. It's an ecosystem, and it's one, like I said, that really hasn't looked at asylum. It's looked at people arriving as refugees. That's a really planned thing. Usually the refugee resettlement agencies can see exactly how many people are coming and how many have come in sort of a month-by-month schedule. And asylum is chaotic. Asylum happens when it happens. People enter the U.S. on lots of different ways. They're afraid to go home. They ask for asylum. It could be from any country in the world, not just specific countries where we're resettling refugees. So it's always been like a little too messy for resettlement. And that's why I think we're going to be bringing some of that together. So I hope that's a map. It's complicated. And I left out undoubtedly important players. So
I think we have a question online here. I'm going to have Nancy read it.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Just one last question from one of the people online. I'm wondering about I'm wondering about the situation at the border and why some of those people are not considered refugees, particularly Haitians, but also Central Americans fleeing violence. How can the U.S. just deport them?
Right.
Thank
That
you.
is an excellent question, and thank you for that, whoever our questioner is.
Yeah.
Thank you, Beth. They are refugees. A refugee becomes a refugee when they are outside their country of origin owing to that well-founded fear of persecution on account of their identity. Right? What they're asking for at the U.S. border is recognition as refugees. We have an obligation to provide everyone with an individualized hearing about that, and we are not doing that. And we have not been doing that for many years. When you get a chance to talk to Dwayne Cronky, he can tell you about how we did not do that in 1981, 82. The moment that we signed into law our refugee law. Right? We have failed to do that on a regular basis. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Often that's a political decision. That's not new to this administration, the previous administration. This is how we've handled the arriving asylum seekers at the U.S. border since we started having a process in 1980. What we're doing right now is using an even more aggressive method or justification for denying people access to that opportunity to be heard, which is called Title 42. It's part of our health code, and it's a public health measure being used to say we can't, we have an emergency exemption because of COVID from fulfilling our refugee protection obligations. That's depriving many people of an opportunity to be heard. Some folks are getting through that, but still must remain in Mexico to have all of their hearings happening literally inside like shipping containers where they go up to the border and they sit in this shipping container and an immigration judge appears by video to hear their asylum claim. These are taking months and months. Sometimes we're seeing people brought in. And in Minnesota, we've seen several waves of asylum seekers from a variety of countries shipped up from the southern border to sit in Minnesota jails while they make their first application, their pre-application called a credible fear screening. for asylum. And so we've had to work with dozens of people from all around the world from detention to try to get them over that first hump so they could then actually apply for asylum. So that's going on and off and on and off. When it comes to Haiti, we have always taken a very aggressive exclusionary approach, and always since Toussaint Louverture led a revolution in Haiti. We have not wanted Haitians in the United States. Throughout the 90s, when there was a lot of political chaos in Haiti, we would interdict boats on the high seas and either take people directly back to Haiti or take them later to Guantanamo Bay where they were pre-processed there. This is the dichotomy between Haiti and Cuba, and today Haiti and Afghanistan is so stark, and I think really goes to the heart of the U.S. as a nation that built itself on slavery and continues to embody the anti-Black racism that came from that. And I don't see a solution to that. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah, all right.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of points of intersection here, what Westminster's already doing, with the relocation with its one particular family. And it looks like there's an opportunity for advocacy, just writing to people in Congress. And I know you're even looking for attorneys who can help you process legally some of the Afghan refugees.
Absolutely.
So there might be a lot of different touch points for us, but I want to thank you for your time today, coming in on a snowy, icy morning and giving a terrific presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.